Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Bonds and Stories, we retell those moments honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. I buttoned Martin's charcoal coat and slid it onto the hanger as if it might still remember the shape of him. Outside Minneapolis was slate and wind. The Basilica of St. Mary rose out of the cold like a ship made of limestone, its steps dusted with a skin of ice that made every footfall deliberate. I told myself to keep the service neat, to keep my hands busy. Order had always been the one thing I could make. Inside, the air smelled of wax and damp wool. Ushers moved like murmurs. A soprano tested a high note, and it trembled in the rafters, feather-light and unsteady. I placed tissues at the end of 2 pews, habit more than hospitality, then guided a couple from our old street to seats by the aisle. Widows learn to move without drawing focus. I took a place midway back, left side, where I could see without being seen. They said the good things. They always do. Martin loved this city. Martin built a firm out of a borrowed conference room and 3 battered desks. Martin hired the kids with muddy boots and turned them into project managers. The words moved past like banners in a parade he would have enjoyed watching from a balcony. I waited for my name as if it were a switch that would bring the room into focus. Not glory, just a thread to tie the story to the kitchen, where I learned the trick of feeding 6 people with 1 pot of stew. To the winter he coughed through, and I counted his pills at midnight, noon, midnight again. The soprano's voice softened. The organ settled into a hum, a spine beneath the words. Caleb rose from the front row, dark suit too rigid in the shoulders. I had bought him that tie with the narrow blue stripes, a quiet tie for courtrooms and pitches. When he found my face, he gave the smallest nod, a stranger's politeness. My father was not simple, he said, voice steady in the way he retained clients measured, warm enough to pass for kind. He did the work that nobody saw. In the last years when things were hard, there is someone I want to thank for standing with him. The Basilica held its breath. I reached for my handbag, pressing the leather until it answered back. I was ready to hear my mother. I had rehearsed how to take it, a nod, a small smile, the unobtrusive dignity of being acknowledged. Thank you, Vivian Hart. The name fell and broke, and the shards kept falling. A woman to my right, gray coat, pearl pin, rose and dabbed carefully at tears that did not threaten to spill. Vivian turned her cheek toward the light as she sat, composed, practiced. You don't work your way into rooms like this without learning where the cameras would be, even in a church where there were none. People did that thing. Half-turns, quick glances, the way you look at an eclipse. I kept my face smooth. If you hold your face still long enough, people call it composure. The organ reached for a hymn. We sang. Or rather, our mouths moved and sound happened somewhere else. After they filed past me with the phrases cities use when they want to be decent. He was a good man, a real builder. A loss for Minneapolis. Hands touched my sleeve, then retreated. A woman from the chamber said she'd always admired my steadiness and did not meet my eyes. Outside Hennepin Avenue breathed out a gust that felt personal. The sky was the color of a steel sheet. The next morning, the wind came in off the river and rattled the bare trees on Kenwood Parkway. I stood in the kitchen with the good coffee pressed and cooling, the house so quiet that even the refrigerator seemed to lower its voice. The doorbell startled me. A courier, shoulders hunched against the cold, held out a thick envelope with the neat rectangle of the firm's logo, Monroe and Wexler Estates. I thought briefly of slipping it unopened into the drawer where warranties go to die. Habit 1. I set it on the dining table, the one with the shallow scar from the Thanksgiving. We dragged a hot pan across it and slid a knife under the flap. By consent of the parties with interest, the letter said we will convene a preliminary allocation meeting at 3 p.m., Brooks and Halverson Partners. The rest was scheduling a conference room on the 15th floor, a list of participants. At 3, the elevator sighed, open to a wall of framed photographs, ribbon cuttings, groundbreaking, steel beams slung against blue sky. I had stood beside Martin in too many of those just outside the crop line. The receptionist's voice held that careful sympathy law firms keep in a drawer. Mrs. Brooks, right this way. The conference room had a view of the river glazed with ice barges moored and patient. Polished table water glasses aligned like a small parade. Caleb sat near the end, hands clasped, eyes on the window. Across from him, Vivian placed a folder with both palms, as though arriving at a panel discussion, calm, angled toward where the power would land. A man from the estate team, hair precise, opened a binder. We'll be efficient, he said. Mr. Brooks executed several beneficiary designation changes over the past 18 months. These are not part of the probate estate. Our role is to acknowledge and implement them. The language was a curtain drawn with a practiced hand. He read, primary residence, Kenwood transfer on death deed to Ms. Hart. Lake property on the North Shore beneficiary designation to Ms. Hart. Non-qualified investment accounts. Series C and D holdings, transfer on death to Ms. Hart. Vehicle titles as listed to Ms. Hart. I looked at the glass and saw two cities layered: Minneapolis in winter, and the reflected room where a woman I barely knew acquired the shape of my life. I thought of the way Martin carried the key to the cabin on his keyring, like a talisman, the way we measured nieces against the pantry molding pencil marks, marching up the doorframe in a history you can't fake. Paper can. Paper does. "Excuse me," I said. The estate man adjusted his pen as if I had bumped it. "These were Martin's choices," he said, and it was not unkind, just final. I turned to my son. The tie with the blue stripes had shifted. He straightened it, then his jaw. "Dad had his reasons," Caleb said. "Reasons." The word sat there between us, as sensible as an invoice. I waited for additional words to show up, something about a conversation I must have missed, a clarification, even a pitying explanation offered the way you hand someone a coat before sending her out into weather. None arrived. Beneath the table, I laced my fingers and felt the small ache in my knuckles from the cold. The estate man continued, smoothing us forward. "Life insurance tax withholdings, a remark about timelines." Vivian didn't speak, which was a skill. She didn't need to. Presence can be an argument all its own. When the meeting broke, chairs gave their soft noises, the kind that pretend rooms aren't alive. Caleb's hand hovered near my shoulder, then thought better of it. "We should talk," he said, the way people suggest salads. "Another time." In the corridor, the framed photos joined one long hallway of things we had built and stood beside. I pressed the elevator button and watched the light glow, then fade, then glow again. Outside, the sun flirted with the idea of late afternoon and then decided against it. The wind took the corner of my scarf and lifted it straight out a flag in a place with nothing to declare. I walked back to the car with the letter folded in my glove, the paper warmed by my palm. Kenwood trees ticked against one another like a pocket watch, refusing to stop. At the house, the lock turned the way it always had. Familiar as a choreography, your body remembers before your mind does. I hung Martin's coat back where it belonged. My fingers grazed the quilted lining and found a ticket stub in the pocket, one of those gray parking receipts that fade if you breathe on them. I laid it on the hall table without reading the date. In the kitchen, the coffee had gone cold and thick. I poured it down the sink and listened to the drain take it away, a small sound in a house that had kept so many larger ones. The window over the sink held the winter light, thin as paper, steady as a ledger line. I sat. The chair creaked, honest about its age. On the table, the letter lay open to the neat code of other people's decisions. I traced a fingernail along the bottom edge just to feel something give. Outside, a plow groaned through the side street and threw a ribbon of snow up against the curb. The noise was ugly and practical. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing the smell of dish soap and lemon oil, and let the sound pass. When it was quiet again, I stood and washed the single cup I had used, dried it, slid it back into the cupboard. I put the folded letter in the drawer by the stove, the one with rubber bands and batteries that no longer fit anything, and shut it with a clean single motion. The house kept its shape. The rooms waited. The day leaned toward evening and did not ask what I would do with it. Morning came gray and frayed. I stood at the hall table and picked up the parking stub I'd pulled from Martin's coat the night before. The heat from the radiator had curled its corners. The ink was half faded, but the numbers were stubborn, a ramp off Lake Street, timestamped 2 Thursdays before Christmas. I turned it over and found a thin smear of pollen as yellow as a bruise. December had no pollen to give. Someone else's season had rubbed off on it. The desk in the mudroom held the things that accumulate when a life tries to stay organized. Rubber bands, warranties, a folder I'd labeled Cabin, North Shore in my own blocky handwriting. I slid the folder free and shook it gently over the table. Bills, a few postcards from nieces, a photocopied map where we'd circled good pie. Near the bottom, an invoice printed on light blue stock fell into my palm. Lake County Association dues 5 years old, and below that a line for decking repairs. The 2 lines stopped me. Not Martin Brooks, attention Vivian Hart. Same box number, same cabin lot, a tidy substitution like replacing a nameplate on a desk drawer and hoping no one hears the scrape. I carried the folder to the kitchen and opened the laptop. The browser sprang up to a news site full of snow advisories and photos of dogs and sweaters. I typed Linden Hills Florals Lake Street and clicked before I could think of a reason not to. Stone Arch Florals popped up first. A photo of a woman arranging tulips that leaned like they'd grown there on purpose. Tulips, pollen dust. I typed Stone Arch Florals credit charges, Brooks, and of course that didn't return anything a browser would show a person. So I went into our bank portal, the one I'd managed for decades without assigning meaning to anything, and searched the past year for Stone Arch. There they were: first Fridays. Third Wednesdays, a cadence a person might dance to if the music were quiet. The card number on the charges was one of the corporate cards Brooks and Halverson Partners expensed as client appreciation. Delivery addresses weren't shown, but the frequency made a pattern out of the days. I made myself stop and drink water before opening a new tab. Vivian Hart. Public profiles have a way of pretending they're not performances. Her Instagram was curated the way you arrange a table, the right napkins, the right light. Babies of friends, charity dinners, a close-up of a pearl pin I'd seen in the basilica. In November, a photo caught me by the throat. A living room the color of cream mullioned windows, a low white couch. Martin knelt by a planter, sleeves pushed back, wrist bones, sharp as if he were 30 again. He was tucking soil around a shallow tray of white tulips, his head tipped in a kind of private tenderness. Behind him, blurred near the edge, Caleb passed with a stack of takeout containers, his mouth open mid-laugh. The caption, "First frost, first blooms." Gratitude. The refrigerator hummed as if it had thoughts on the matter. I set the laptop aside and pulled on Martin's parka out of habit before remembering it wasn't mine to wear, not anymore. I took my own coat and drove down Hennepin, then west, the wipers ticking against a dusting of dry snow. Stone Arch Florals was warm and damp summer hiding behind glass. The counter was covered in carnations like confetti that hadn't yet been thrown. "Can I help you?" The clerk asked a young man whose hair did not know winter. "I'm wondering about your corporate accounts," I said, hearing the flatness in my voice and softening it. "I used to run expenses. We had an account, Brooks and Halverson." He brightened the way people do when confronted with something their system can actually find. He pulled up a screen and nodded. "Yeah, regular Fridays, sometimes Wednesdays. Delivery too," and then he stopped, eyes catching on something he had been trained to protect. "We don't give out addresses," he said. Apologetic but firm. "Of course," I said. "Could you tell me if the notes say front desk or residence?" He looked again, scanning. "Says residence drop most times. Once it says use side gate." He colored as if he'd said something indecent. I thanked him and bought a single stem of something white without naming it, and he wrapped it in paper that crinkled like an apology. From the flower shop I drove without telling myself where. The grid shifted under my tires, streets tightening into Linden Hills houses set back with the kind of confidence that rises from old trees. I parked on a side street and walked past a row of porches where wind chimes tried to be brave. On one corner, a house wore the same mullioned windows I'd seen in the photo. A planter by the steps held soil smoothed with the flat of a hand, and the pale spikes of bulbs set too early the way impatient people garden. A delivery tag half frozen to the siding fluttered stone arch. I kept going. I have never been one to test doors. The dealership off Excelsior had a service bay that smelled like belts and rain. I stood at the counter while a woman in a navy shirt tapped her keyboard. "I'm looking for work orders from November," I said, "for North Star Strategy LLC. She frowned, half confusion, half policy, then turned to a board clipped with keys and tickets. "I can't release records without the owner." "I understand." "I'd like to schedule an appointment for their vehicle," I said, which was true in the way facts can be arranged. "Do you know the model?" she asked. "Black SUV," I said, and she nodded like 50% of the city had just raised a hand. "They've got a 2019 QX80 with us," she said before catching herself. "I mean, I can take your name and—" She slid a card across the counter. The font read North Star Strategy in the upper corner with a contact number, creamstock expensive ink. The card must have been left behind at some point. Businesses and habits shed little skins. I thanked her and left, turning the card over in my pocket until the edges had my fingerprints. At home, the light had shifted to that thin amber that lies. I spread what I had on the dining table, the HOA invoice with Vivian's name, the credit charges printed from the bank portal, the florist card, a phone photo of the Linden Hills planter with its shallow knife mark in the soil. I added the parking stub in the top left corner like a caption for a picture that hadn't yet been taken. The paper made that soft whisper it makes when pieces touch. I do not know if grief sharpens or dulls a person. I only know it makes you judge weight differently. These pages weighed more than they looked. I called Rosa Kim. We hadn't spoken properly in years, not since a church auction, where she bought a quilt and I bought a tin of cookies we both knew had been baked by a woman who used butter as a vocation. Rosa had become a forensic accountant in the way children say they'll become firefighters. One day she simply was one. "Come by," she said. "Bring everything." Her office was above a travel agency whose posters insisted on beaches that did not concern Minnesota. Rosa's space smelled faintly of pencil shavings and old glue, comforting in a grade school way. She pressed a mug of tea into my hands and put on her glasses. I slid the folder to her, and she began the ritual. Numbers are not cold to people who live inside them. They are stories told without adjectives. She started with the bank printouts. Corporate card ending in 4411, she said, expensed under client appreciation. Regular cadence. She reached for a legal pad, drew a line across the middle, and ticked marks down one side, every 4 to 6 weeks like church. She typed North Star Strategy LLC into a database. The screen blinked, coughed up a registration. Filed 3 years ago. Registered agent's address is a box at a shipping store. Website. She clicked. Dead link. EIN valid now, but not the first year. She leaned closer to the screen and winced. These invoices, she said when I passed her the copies I'd found in the cabinet marked Vendor Retention Program Share, identical formatting, same hard return after the date, same comma before LLC in the header, same misspelling of advisory. Different amounts, different dates, same bones. She spread them like a deck and looked at them the way a person looks at a hand that isn't quite random. Somebody templated this, she said. Rosa pulled up a graph and mapped the transfers from vendor retention to North Star. The bars rose and fell, but their shadows lined up. They pushed payments just outside internal review cycles, she said, almost admiring the precision. Quarter ends here. The checks clear here. She circled the gaps with a pen that bled a little. If this was a true retention program, you'd see a diversity of vendors. I see one siphon with a nice paint job. She didn't hurry. The tea cooled in my hands and then warmed again when I cupped it. Outside snow patted at the window like a cat, who had forgotten it only pretends to want in. Rosa kept going in her quiet teacher voice. We'll need to validate North Star's officers, look for any overlap with. She stopped herself from saying Martin. She set the pen down and looked at me over the frames. Do you want to keep going? Some questions have a weight you can feel when they land. I nodded. She nodded back an exchange that was almost a contract. I showed her the Instagram photo and she studied the background like it was a crime scene and a family portrait at once. There, she said, tapping the blurred line of Caleb's shoulder, not for scandal, but for context. That's not nothing. She flagged the HOA invoice with a sticky tab the color of late lemons. Also not nothing. She scribbled stone arch in the margin near the list of charges. Patterns connect people to money, not feelings to claims. When I left, the folder was heavier with copies and lighter with a kind of ignorance I hadn't known I was carrying. On the sidewalk, the snow had quit pretending and begun to fall in earnest. Each flake held its geometry for a second longer than seemed decent, then softened into the general white. In the car, I sat with the engine off and the heat bleeding away, looking at the card in my pocket, the line of numbers pressed deep enough to feel with a thumb. Back at the house, I set the folder on the table and went to the sink to wash my hands. The water ran over my wrists, turning the skin red where it was thin. I dried them on a towel we'd bought at a roadside store up near Two Harbors because it had loons on it and we'd laughed at our own sentimentality. I returned to the table and laid the pieces again as if arrangement could grant absolution. Tulips. Pollen on a winter stub. HOA dues to Vivian Hart. North Star Strategy with an EIN that arrived late to its own party. A company account dressed up as gratitude. My son's blur in somebody else's living room. The smell of toner rose from the copies, clean and chemical, and the room steadied around it. What sat before me was not a story about faithlessness or even love, not in the way stories like to be told. It was bone and ink and dates in a ledger. I slid the chair back, and it made the small, respectful sound a chair should make, and I stood until the blood caught up with me. The house held. The paper kept its shape. The day moved on without asking permission, and on the table the pattern I could not unknow arranged itself into the only kind of truth paper ever promises a trail. I followed the paper the way you follow a plow line after a storm straight, because straight is the only thing that makes sense when everything else is drifted. The Hennepin County Government Center keeps its heat too high in winter, as if it means to make up for the wind outside. I took a number and stood with contractors and couples and men, renewing permits for things that click. When it was my turn, I asked for certified copies of the deed on the Kenwood house and any recent beneficiary filings. The clerk wore a cardigan the color of oatmeal and stamped dates with the satisfaction of a small god. The printout slid across the counter, official and heavy. Transfer on death, it said. Beneficiary Vivian Hart. The cabin in Lake County would be a separate trip. The woman told me how much the postage would be if I wanted them to mail it. I handed over my debit card and watched the screen blink accepted. On the skyway level, I found a bench and spread the copies on my lap. The language was neat, as legal language likes to be, and so sure of itself that it read like weather. There were no adjectives, only arrangements. The signatures looked like the ghosts of men exhaling. I slid the packet back into the manila folder and held it against my coat as if heat would matter to paper. Rosa peered at the certified copies through her lenses, then set them on the corner of her desk like anchors. Good, she said, not as comfort, but as data. Next, we want corporate. She opened the Secretary of State website and typed with the economical speed of someone who has taught her fingers to be honest. North Star Strategy LLC filings, annual renewals agent changes. They changed registered agents twice, she said, tapping the screen. Both drop boxes. She flipped to another database and pulled a scanned PDF, an early invoice saved as an image with the clumsy crop of a person who learned a program just enough to operate it. Same comma before LLC, she said, circling with her pen. Same misspelling of advisory. She looked at me over the frames. Repetition is the friend of proof. I told her about the dealership card. Rosa smiled, a small twist to one side. Service records are polite until subpoenaed, she said, then picked up the phone and called a contact in a voice that left room for yes. When she hung up, she drew a quick box and arrow diagram, labeling the arrows with amount states and notations that would look like nothing to someone else. We'll need a lawyer, she said. It wasn't advice, it was a sentence that completed itself. I called Alicia Monroe, a name a friend at church texted me with the line, smart, unflappable. She answered on the second ring, voice low and rested. Her office sat 22 floors up in a tower that made the winter light into a set piece. The waiting room had the kind of quiet chairs that make you feel like improving yourself. Alicia came out in a dark suit that didn't announce itself and shook my hand with a grip that landed and released without apology. I'm Alicia, she said. Not related to Monroe and Wexler, she added with a half smile when she noticed my glance at the framed diplomas, different branch of the tree altogether. In her conference room, the glass wall held the river like a photograph. I set the manila folders on the table and watched her build order out of them. She didn't murmur or perform concern. She arranged. Certified deed beneficiary designations. HOA invoice with Vivian's name lists of Stone Arch charges, a printout of North Star's filings. Rosa's chart and the grainy Instagram capture with Caleb blurred like an afterthought of light. She read first, then asked questions that walked my answers into usable shape. How long did you manage household finances? Which corporate card did he carry? Do you have access to the vendor retention cabinet? I said yes, yes, and yes. When she asked if I understood what I was starting, I put both palms on the table and met her eyes. I understand the difference between a story and an audit, I said. Alicia's mouth made the briefest sign of approval, an exhale almost. We'll proceed on 2 tracks, she said. Probate adjacent relief to challenge non-probate transfers tainted by misconduct and a civil claim for misappropriation against North Star and any knowing recipients. The posture matters. She pulled a thin folder from a drawer. Did you and Mr. Brooks sign any marital property addenda when his firm took on outside investors? I blinked at the phrasing she used to keep people from becoming first names. We signed a postnup the year he refied the house to buy out a partner, I said. His attorney insisted. Find it, she said, not unkind, and pushed a yellow pad toward me with a list postnup. Corporate bylaws, retention policy, internal audit calendars. At home, I pulled the blue file box from the hall closet, the one that held the kind of paper you only need when you least want to look at it. The postnuptial agreement sat in a plastic sleeve, initials neat at every page. Alicia scanned the lines with a finger. This clause, she said, tapping. In the event of intentional misconduct involving community or corporate assets to support a non-spousal beneficiary, any non-probate transfers executed during the pendency of such misconduct shall be voidable at the election of the spouse. It's not a morals clause, she said, anticipating the misnomer. It's an asset protection clause, drafted by someone who'd seen too many people try to make private generosity with other people's money. She slid the sleeve back toward me. This helps? We spent 3 afternoons making copies. The copier in Alicia's office sounded like rain on a tin roof. Affidavits grew in a stack, my statement. Rosa's with an exhibit list that read like a short, unhappy book. A note from the HOA manager confirming where their invoices had been directed. The notary wore a red scarf and took her stamp seriously. She watched me sign as if signatures could lie if she didn't look directly at them. I took the Blue Line light rail to Lake Street for a change of air and walked the 2 blocks to Stone Arch Florals again this time to ask if they would sign a business records affidavit confirming the pattern of deliveries in the aggregate. The manager read Alicia's form with a knotted brow and then said, We can say we deliver to that neighborhood on those dates, yes. We don't keep names with addresses beyond the account. His pen lifted and fell. The ink looked brave against the page. On a Tuesday, my phone lit with Caleb. I answered in the kitchen with my hand on the counter as if the grout lines might steady me. Mom. He said, his voice formal as if we were colleagues with a calendar conflict. I heard you've hired an attorney. Rumor travels inside firms the way steam travels inside old pipes invisibly, but you feel it. I have, I said. The silence after that had a shape. This makes you look vindictive, he said. Dad did what he thought was right. I almost laughed not at him but at the way a sentence can sound like weather. He did what he thought he could get away with, I said, and immediately wished for a softer phrase. But I am weary of soft. This is about the company's money, Caleb, and about the house you grew up in being transferred out of your family because your father put his name under someone else's address. He exhaled as if I had asked him to carry something heavy across a frozen lake. You're destroying his memory, he said. No, I answered, and the word surprised me with its steadiness. I'm refusing to let his memory destroy the true parts of my life. The line went quiet, the kind of quiet that in some rooms means attention. I have a meeting, he said finally, and hung up. Alicia filed the initial petition in Hennepin County Civil. The clerk at the window wore a pin shaped like the state, tilted a little, and took the filing fee without ceremony. We served North Star Vivian and the personal representative handling the non-probate transfers. Process servers tell stories if you let them, but Alicia doesn't let people she likes documents to do their own speaking. She scheduled a motion to freeze the Kenwood title and the North Shore beneficiary designations pending determination. You can't unring a bell, she said, and then smiled a brief apology for the cliché. The days arranged themselves into a choreography of errands that felt like Prairie County records, notary stamps, business records, certifications, copies of vendor retention policies that sounded sunny until you read the exclusions. Rosa built a timeline that ran along the conference table like a set of rails, the 4 to 6 week cadence of payments to North Star, the quarterly reviews ducked by days, the spike that coincided with the Thanksgiving. I drove Martin to urgent care at midnight for a cough that didn't stop. The bars on the chart looked like a city skyline. I tried not to think of it that way. Alicia requested emails through Discovery and drafted interrogatories that read like polite interrogations. Do you maintain an office list employees? Provide copies of all invoices, work product, and reports delivered to Brooks and Halverson. Identify any personal relationship between Ms. Hart and Mr. Brooks. The language did its work without adjectives. That is how language is supposed to work in rooms with seals on the wall. At night, the house learned new sounds, my printer, the weight of 3-hole punches, the whisper of tabs being peeled and pressed. I slept with the bedroom door open and the hallway light off the way you do when you want the dark to earn its keep. In the morning, I packed a canvas bag with exhibits labeled A through something too far down the alphabet. I found the little stapler Martin used to call the emergency stapler because it lived in the junk drawer with batteries that were no longer true. I put it in the bag anyway. By the second week, Star Tribune had a short piece in the business section about a dispute over beneficiary designations and vendor payments at a mid-size infrastructure firm. The reporter left a message I did not return. I stood at the kitchen counter and read the article twice, then folded it along the crease and slipped it under the manila tab marked press. The word looked foreign in our house. I poured coffee, drank it standing, and washed the cup before the sink could make a story of it. The morning the court set a date on Alicia's motion, the mail brought a letter from Lake County Recorder with a copy of the Cabins Association bylaws clipped to the back. Someone had written see HEIR 8.3 in blue pen, where it explained who could receive notices, the owner of record or the owner's designated agent. The copy of the notice list had Vivian's address typed cleanly. I held the packet by its edges and could feel the press of the type through the paper, a tooth under fingertip. We met again in Alicia's conference room. She set the new documents at the end of the timeline like ties on a railroad bed. We are not arguing jealousy, she said. We are arguing structure. Money went out on a pattern. Services did not come back on a pattern. Transfers were executed during that period to a recipient of those funds. The agreement you and Mr. Brooks signed gives the court a lever. Rosa gives the court the fulcrum. She closed the folder, and the room felt smaller, not with fear, but with purpose. When I left the building, the sky had taken on that blunt brightness winter gets when the clouds thin without giving up. On Nicolay, a bus sighed at the curb. A man in a yellow hat laughed into his phone. I walked to the car with the canvas bag on my shoulder, the strap biting a little where it crossed the coat. The weight was honest. At home, I unlocked the door, set the bag on the dining table, and took off my boots with both hands. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil from the cloth I had used that morning. I opened the bag and stacked the folders, A on top of B on top of C, ordinary letters made sturdy by ink and order. The furnace kicked on and the vent near the floor sighed. On the counter, the emergency stapler sat, where I'd left it small and ready as if it had been waiting all along. The calendar gave us a Wednesday, the sort of winter day Minneapolis sets out like a cold plate. I woke before the alarm and dressed in the dark so the house wouldn't have to notice. The canvas bag waited by the door with its alphabet of tabs. I looped the strap across my coat and felt the tug settle into my shoulder, honest as a promise. Hennepin County's courthouse was busy with its own weather boots, squeaking on stone elevators, sighing voices hushed by habit more than respect. Alicia met me on the mezzanine, her hair pinned back, a legal pad under one arm. "We're in 16C, she said. "Judge Rasmussen." She didn't add adjectives. We walked down the hall where the ceilings carried sound away like water. Inside the courtroom, the seal on the wall did what seals do, insisted on order without giving any. Vivian sat at the defense table in a navy dress that understood how to be looked at. Her lawyer, a silver-shouldered man with a voice trained to land on the last word, stacked binders, as if symmetry could win a case. Rosa took a seat behind our table, calm in the way of people who have already done most of their work before the room notices. When the clerk called the case, Brooks versus Hart et al., the judge came in with her reading glasses low on her nose, the kind of posture that says she has learned to see through performances. We rose, then sat, then breathed. Alicia spoke first, her tone the even register she uses when she wants every word to count once. "Your Honor. We are before the court on two related issues, a motion to enjoin non-probate transfers executed during a period of misappropriation and the merits of our civil claim for misappropriation against North Star Strategy, LLC, and Ms. Hart as a knowing recipient." Opposing counsel stood, hands planted on the lectern in a way that implied ownership. "Your Honor, this is a family dispute dressed up as corporate litigation. North Star Strategy provided brand strategy and stakeholder engagement services. Compensation was proper. Mr. Brooks, a sophisticated principal, had full authority to designate non-probate beneficiaries. The court should not police a deceased man's generosity." The judge looked down over her glasses. "We will police money," she said, "if the law tells us to." She turned to Alicia. "Proceed." Alicia began where evidence should, with Bones. She entered the vendor retention program policy, then the ledger of payments to North Star. The charts Rosa had built ran on the screen like a restrained skyline bars, placed at 4 to 6 week intervals, quarter after quarter, their shadows overlapping the firm's internal review calendar. Payments were repeatedly timed just outside internal review cycles, Alicia said. "No other vendor in the program exhibits this cadence." We moved to invoices. Alicia held the first exhibit close enough for the judge to see. Across 48 invoices spanning 6 years, she said we see identical formatting, down to a consistent misplaced comma in the header, North Star Strategy LLC, and the misspelling of advisory as advisory. The court will also note the absence of a physical office employees or a functioning website during the first 2 years of billings. She clicked through the exhibits, the same font, the same hard returns, a sameness that could be felt before it was explained. Opposing counsel rose. "Formatting similarities are not fraud," he said. "A template is common practice." He tapped his binder. "We have affidavits attesting to meetings held and recommendations made." Alicia did not turn. "We have asked for work products," she said. "There are none." She paused long enough to make the absence a shape. "We have asked for calendars, travel, or deliverables. There are none." "What exists are transfers." Rosa testified next, credentials in a single clean paragraph. She traced the money without ornament, her finger moving over the chart, the way a conductor marks time. "Payments total $940,000 over 6 years, she said. "The pattern is consistent with siphoning, disguised as retention. The lack of diversity in vendors is atypical. The EIN associated with North Star was not active during initial billings." She did not look at Vivian while she spoke. She looked at the paper. When Alicia finished with her, the judge had no questions. "That is a kind of respect." Opposing counsel called Vivian. She swore in right hand steady. Up close, the pearl pin at her collar looked like a small moon. "Ms. Hart," her lawyer asked, "did you provide consulting services to Brooks and Halverson Partners?" "Yes," she said. Voice balanced like a glass on a flat table. "Stakeholder mapping, brand elevation, community partnerships. And were you compensated fairly for your expertise?" "Yes." Alicia stood for cross. She did not pace. "Ms. Hart, do you maintain an office?" "I work remotely," Vivian said. "Do you have employees, contractors as needed? Do you have any emails to Brooks and Halverson transmitting deliverables?" "Many of our conversations were in person," Vivian said. Alicia nodded as if that were a weather report. "Who designed your invoices?" "A template," Vivian said. "From where I don't recall." Alicia held up 2 invoices from different years. "Can you explain why a typo appears identically, including spacing and line breaks across 5 years? Vivian's smile thinned. "I'm not a typist," she said. "I focus on strategy." Alicia shifted. "Ms. Hart, have you received HOA correspondence for the North Shore cabin?" "I've managed logistics when asked," Vivian said. "Asked by whom?" "By Martin." Alicia let the first name hang a second. "Did you receive a transfer on death deed to the Kenwood residence?" I was named beneficiary, Vivian said. Do you believe those transfers are unrelated to the payments from North Star? They are separate matters, Vivian said now, watching the judge instead of Alicia. Alicia's last question was the kind that doesn't sound like much until it lands. Ms. Hart, can you show the court a single report slide deck or memo you produced for Brooks and Halverson? Vivian adjusted the pearl pin as if it had grown heavy. My value was advisory, she said. Advisory. Advisory. The word acquired weight by repetition. I testified briefly. Alicia did not make my life a story. She asked me to identify signatures, the post-nuptial agreement, the periods I managed our accounts, the fact of the Stone Arch charges. Opposing counsel asked if I disliked Ms. Hart. I don't know her, I said, which was true in the most useful way. We broke for 10 minutes. In the hallway, the vending machine hummed like a strange kind of choir. Caleb stood at the far end, hands in his pockets, jaw tight enough to cut paper. He looked at me, then at the floor tile, a pattern of squares that did not decide anything. He started to say something and stopped. When we filed back in, he took a seat behind Vivian an inch closer than necessary. Closing was short. Alicia returned to the post-nup clause, reading it the way you read instructions that keep you from hurting yourself. In the event of intentional misconduct involving community or corporate assets to support a non-spousal beneficiary, any non-probate transfers executed during the pendency of such misconduct shall be voidable at the election of the spouse. This is not about grief, she said. It is about structure. Money went out on a pattern without corresponding services. Transfers to that same recipient occurred within the pendency. The agreement gives the remedy. The evidence supplies the reason. Opposing counsel gestured toward the binders as if they could testify. Mr. Brooks chose to care for someone who cared for him, he said. The court should not unwind choice merely because the plaintiff is unhappy with its optics. The judge removed her glasses and set them on the bench, a small sound that made the room listen. I have reviewed the exhibits and the testimony, she said. I find the following. The payments to North Star Strategy, LLC, are unsupported by work product. The pattern of timing to avoid internal review cycles is persuasive. The repetition of formatting anomalies across years is corroborative. The lack of office employees or functional web presence during initial billings is significant. I further find that during the period of these payments, Mr. Brooks executed transfer on death designations naming Ms. Hart as beneficiary of the Kenwood residence, the North Shore property, and certain non-qualified investment accounts. She lifted the post-nup clause. The parties' agreement anticipates precisely this class of misconduct. Under that agreement, those transfers are voidable at the spouse's election. The court grants the injunction, voids the transfer on death designations as to Ms. Hart, and orders title to remain with or revert to Ms. Brooks pending final probate administration. On the civil claim judgment for the plaintiff, $940,000 against North Star Strategy, LLC, and Ms. Hart jointly and severally, plus statutory interest. Fees will be addressed by motion. She replaced her glasses. That is the order. The gavel touched wood, a sound more practical than theatrical. For a breath, the room did nothing. Then it remembered itself all at once. Papers, chairs, everyone suddenly busy with being seen doing the right thing next. Vivian's lawyer leaned toward her voice, low words shaped to be soothing. She didn't look soothed. Her hand found the pearl at her collar and stayed there as if it were a bead to count. Alicia closed our folder as if closing a drawer. Rosa gave the faintest nod, a ledger balanced in a human gesture. My knees remembered they had been standing. We gathered our copies with the care of people who have learned what paper can do. When I turned, Caleb was already on his feet. He touched Vivian's elbow in a small, steadying way that made something in my chest move without my consent. He did not look at me. They stepped into the aisle and went toward the door with the purposeful walk people use when the hallway is the whole plan. The door swung once, twice, then settled. Outside, Nicolette carried the day as if this were any other Wednesday. The wind had picked up and scraped along the buildings. I stood under the overhang while Alicia spoke with a reporter in sentences that used no adjectives. Rosa shook my hand and said she'd email the digitals for my records. When they left, I stayed where the air hit the edge of the awning and scattered snow sideways. I walked to the parking ramp with the canvas bag tucked against me, the strap biting a familiar groove. The elevator smelled of wool and road salt. On the 4th level, light pooled on the concrete the way winter light does, thin, willing, unpersuaded. I unlocked the car, set the bag on the passenger seat, and sat with my hands on the wheel until the heat came through. Back at the house, the lock turned. The rooms received me in their old practiced way. I set the bag on the dining table and took off my coat. The furnace kicked on and the vent hissed. I poured water into the kettle and waited for it to find its sound. On the hall table, the folded Monroe and Wexler letter lay, where I had left it weeks ago, a relic from a different weather system. I slid it into the drawer with the rubber bands and batteries, closed the drawer, and felt the clean click of wood meeting wood. I made tea. The steam rose a soft, unambitious column. I carried the mug to the window over the sink and watched the street, the bare maples throwing thin lines across the snow, the plow's ridge along the curb holding its shape like a boundary someone had believed in when it was fresh. I drank. The cup warmed my hand back to itself. The house kept its breath. The order held. The day did not explain itself. 2 winters came and scrubbed the city clean and dirty again. The Kenwood house learned my rhythms without asking for explanations. Title work finished. The cabin keys came back by certified mail in an envelope that looked like it should have carried something kinder. In summer, I took a rented paddleboard out on Lake Harriet at 7 in the morning when the water held its breath, knees shaky, arms, unsure then steadier than steady. In winter, I skied the chain of lakes when the groomer had just passed the tracks, 2 silver seams in a field of white. I paid bills, trimmed lilacs, fixed a drip under the kitchen sink by watching a video made by a man with gentle hands. The company sent me a dividend that felt less like money than like a correction. The phone stayed mostly quiet. One March, close to midnight, the screen lit with a name I had trained myself not to expect. Caleb. The message was 4 words at Riverside. It's time. I dressed without turning on lights and drove down Hennepin beneath street lamps that made small tired islands on the pavement. The hospital doors sighed open like a decision. The maternity floor smelled the way laundry does when it has almost dried. A coffee machine hissed in the corner. Vending machines glowed with a softness that made you feel forgiven for nothing in particular. A nurse at the desk glanced at the clock and then at me. Family, she asked. Yes, I said, and she nodded because she had learned not to sort love by paperwork. Caleb stood by a window looking at the black pane as if the city might answer back. His hair was shorter. There was a thinness at his temples I hadn't noticed forming. He turned, and whatever case he had been preparing for 2 years dropped out of his hands without ceremony. Mom, he said, and the word landed like something returned after being found under furniture. We stood without closing the space, both of us old enough to know there are rooms you stop in before you get to the right one. She's okay, I asked. She's a force, he said. Naomi, he added, and the name fit the hallway. We sat in 2 molded chairs with a low table between us, where someone had left a magazine open to a page full of gardens that would never make it through a Minnesota April. I was wrong, he said, looking at his hands, as if the confession belonged to them and not to his mouth. I wanted to keep Dad the way I understood him. I used you up to do it. I don't know how I did that. I don't know how I let someone else redraw our house. The corridor kept its hum. A cart rattled past with blankets folded so tight they looked ironed. I could hear my own pulse under the quiet. You were loyal to a picture, I said. Pictures are persuasive. He nodded, a small movement that seemed to take more work than nods should. When you filed, I said you were destroying his memory. He lifted his eyes to me and did not blink. I was the one doing that. I was painting over the parts that didn't match. We let the silence sit like a third chair. Somewhere down the hall, a baby announced itself. The cry was not loud so much as irreducible like math. Caleb exhaled in a way I had once watched him exhale before track meets. We don't have to talk about all of it, he said. If he's going to carry my name, I don't want to give him a story that breaks when he shakes it. A nurse leaned around the doorway. Naomi says 1 visitor, she said, and then seeing both of us, added, and then the other. She didn't say who should go first. I stood, and Caleb stood at the same time, and then we did that small, polite dance people do when they both try to hold a door, except there was no door, only air, in a hallway that had already forgiven worse choreography. You go, he said, and it was not generous so much as exact. In the room, Naomi's face was pale and victorious. The baby had the look all new faces have, uncommitted, as if deciding what to be. I touched 2 fingers to the soft place on his head where the world had not yet hardened anything, and then I moved my hand away because love needs less contact than it thinks. Naomi smiled the way people smile when they see someone who knows where the extra blankets are. Hi, Eleanor, she said. He's efficient. I laughed, the kind that doesn't show teeth. He'll get that from you, I said, and Naomi made a face that admitted possibility. Back in the hall, I took the chair and Caleb went in. The window showed the river black and flat, the city's sodium lights pressed into it like coins. When he returned, his shoulders had changed shape by a degree only a mother would measure. He sat and rested his forearms on his knees, palms open as if he had just remembered what hands were for. Coffee, I asked. He grinned without showing it. From a machine, he said. A brave choice. We walked to the corner where the buttons lit up like a quiet arcade and watched paper cups fill with a substance that has only a social relationship to coffee. It was hot. It was enough. Dawn thinned the window. We took the stairs to the lobby because elevators feel dishonest after certain nights. Outside, the air was the contrary kind that promises spring while showing you a stubborn pile of snow in the shade. Along the river path, a great blue heron lifted itself out of the dark water as if from memory wings spreading into a geometry that solved itself on the fly. It rose, turned once, then arrowed south, where the channel bent away from the buildings. Caleb watched his cup steaming in both hands. "I didn't know they stayed this far into March," he said. "They go where the water gives," I said. We stood until the bird was nothing but a thought the air had. He bumped my shoulder with his, the gentlest contact, a signature that didn't demand reading. We walked back inside because babies ask the day to begin whether or not anyone is ready. The doors breathed open. The heat met our faces. We carried the cups like proof we had gone out and come back. The corridor held its old humming truce. On the whiteboard by Naomi's door, a nurse had written a name in dry erase blue, each letter clear and undecorated. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.